Then your CTQ is due on Thursday. Good luck. All right, now that stupid video's over, let's check the news. What is going on in the world? What's this? Trump supporters storming Capitol Hill? Nah, they gotta mean like they're just outside protesting or something. Oh my gosh, they actually did make it into the Capitol building? They're just walking around in there. Dude, where's the security? All right, well, I just hope things don't get violent. Oh my gosh. Will this guy get lost on his way to Comic-Con? He's in the president of the Senate's chair. They just walked into the Senate. I wonder how things are going in the House of Representatives. Oh no. Oh, great. Even other countries are starting to report on us like we're some failed third world state. Oh, this is really bad. Should I even talk about this next week in my lessons? What if a parent doesn't like what I say and I get in trouble? Man, you can't afford to lose your job now. You just bought a couch. But how could I not? I mean, our nation's capital has never been breached by a mob like this before. Oh, there goes the speaker's podium. This is going to go in the history books. Curious how they're going to explain this guy. Okay, fair enough. But how on earth are you going to explain this without being biased? Because some objectively bad stuff happened and violence was used that ended up in some people dying. And okay, you're right. You got to talk about it. But how? You got a week to figure it out till you film your next video. I mean, your students tell you all the time that their brains work better when they procrastinate. So why not give it a try yourself? You'll figure it out. Yeah, you'll figure it out. You'll be fine. So I was planning on finishing up the Bill of Rights this week with y'all and going over the 9th and the 10th Amendment, but I couldn't not talk about the storming of the Capitol. And actually, it relates to two constitutional amendments that we're going to talk about later, so I figured why not just take the lessons on those two amendments and move them up to right here where we can talk about this scenario where they actually are relevant and apply. So a couple of you emailed me and asked me what the heck was going on, so I thought it would be better to actually make a video and explain what happened with that whole situation at the Capitol and what might still happen or has already happened by the time you're watching this video. But how to explain it to y'all without being biased.
What you want, what you really need is a story.
A story can be true or false.
I leave such judgments to you, Inspector.
That's good advice, straight out of V from Vendetta. I'll tell the story as accurately as I can. I will leave you to judge it. Now, as you may remember, last fall there was a presidential election between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and with the whole COVID pandemic going on and everything, there were a lot of people mailing in their ballots instead of showing up to the polling location to vote. Now, before the election, President Trump was already accusing Democrats of trying to rig the election by making fake mail-in ballots that would be counted that weren't really attached to any real voters. He accused them of trying to overcount Democratic ballots and maybe not even count some Republican ballots and potentially losing Republican ballots, all to try to give Joe Biden an edge in the presidential election. Democrats said, he's just being a sore loser because his polling numbers are down right now. He wants to already set himself up with an excuse for why he might lose. And you all remember Election Day. It actually took him a lot longer than usual to count up all of the ballots and stuff because, there's a pandemic going on. In many states, they counted the in-person votes first, and most people that voted in person were Republicans, and more people that voted mail-in ballot were Democrats. So at first it looked like President Trump was running away with the election and it was going to be a big upset. But then as the mail-in ballots began to be counted, Joe Biden began to gain all that ground back, and eventually he ended up winning. In 3 of the critical swing states that Trump needed to win, that Biden ended up winning, he accused the states of engaging in election fraud: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Trump and his lawyers argued that the Dominion voting machines that were used for people to cast their ballots on were hacked by people trying to get Joe Biden to win. But while the judicial system was trying to handle all these accusations, President Trump was claiming that he was the rightful winner of the election and refused to recognize Joe Biden as the president-elect. In all, President Trump and his team of lawyers filed 62 lawsuits against various states accusing them of election fraud. They ended up losing 61 out of the 62 cases. While many Republicans were supportive of President Trump and his lawsuits at first, as he began to lose the lawsuits, so too did he begin to lose support with Republicans. Finally, in December, the Electoral College rolled around and the electors met and cast their official votes for president. Then, according to Article 2 of the Constitution, the Vice President oversees a joint session of Congress where both the House and the new Senate all get together, and he opens the ballots from the Electoral College and makes the official vote. That's all he does, is he just simply counts them. That's all the Constitution says that the Vice President does. And the reason why Article 2 has the Vice President making the official count of the ballots from the Electoral College in front of both chambers of Congress is so that if no candidate gets a majority of the Electoral College votes, then the House of Representatives can immediately vote for someone to win the election, because that's what happens if no candidate gets a majority. And the House of Representatives will then vote for president, where each delegation from each state gets one vote. Majority wins. Now, President Trump argued that his Vice President, Mike Pence, had the constitutional power to throw out some of the Electoral College votes from the states that he had accused of engaging in election fraud. He argued that at the very least, the Vice President and Congress didn't have to certify the election results to make it official.
States want to revote. The states got defrauded. They were given false information. They voted on it. Now they want to recertify. They want it back. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. We will never give up. We will never concede. It doesn't happen. You don't concede when there's theft involved.
So the Republican Party was fractured. Some in the Republican Party believed the election was rigged and that Donald Trump was the rightful winner of the election and that he should stay in power, while some in the Republican Party said, sure, there may have been some election fraud, but there's no evidence that there was enough to change the result of the election. It felt like Trump was in denial and was kind of being a sore loser. This put Mike Pence in a really tough spot. I mean, after all, he is Donald Trump's vice president. Which side of the Republican Party would he go with?
If the liberal Democrats take the Senate and the White House, and they're not taking this White House, we're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now. And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
So, as we got closer to the day that Congress would count up the official ballots, the battle lines were quickly being drawn. Some prominent Republican senators, including Ted Cruz, said they were siding with Trump.
We will not go quietly into the night.
So on January 6th, there was a big rally with a ton of Trump supporters that showed up to support the president. And Trump wanted them there.
We're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country.
So at the rally, some of Trump's family members, his top lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and Trump himself spoke, and they said some things that kind of riled people up.
And we need to march on the Capitol today.
We are going to take our country back.
We're coming for you, and we're going to have a good time doing it.
Let's have trial by combat.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength. We're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you, to the Capitol.
Yeah, all right, so not the most soft-toned rhetoric there. Some may interpret them to be fighting words, and some did interpret those to be fighting words.
You want to fight? You better believe you got one.
Now, how exactly these people actually got into the Capitol building, I think people are still trying to figure out. There's some evidence that some of the police officers there actually let them through. Some of the police officers even took selfies with them. But that's something we're still probably going to figure out here over the next, I don't know how long. The storming of the Capitol interrupted the debates over the Electoral College, and many of the senators and members of the House of Representatives were evacuated. As I'm recording this, so far we know that 5 people died in the storming of the Capitol. It included some protesters and some police officers there. Unfortunately, as this mob mentality grew, some people were stampeded over, shots were fired, some police officers were killed in all of the chaos. President Trump quickly tried to go on Twitter and national TV to try to calm the mob down, but at that point, they'd already kind of been set loose and done their damage. The mob actually did make their way into the House and Senate chambers, and as some of the pictures I showed you previously, people actually sat in the president of the Senate's chair. There was this guy that stole Speaker Nancy Pelosi's little podium. Windows broken, fax were stolen. It took the police quite some time to get everyone out of there. Finally, once everyone was cleared out of the Capitol, Congress got back to work. Vice President Pence felt like he did not have the constitutional authority to overturn the election or to uncertify certain states or to throw them out, because the Constitution only says that the vice president is there to simply count the votes. It doesn't say that they do anything else. I mean, the whole thing is more ceremonial than anything else. Remember, the Constitution leaves the power of conducting elections to the states. So it's the states that get to decide who their electors are and whether or not their electors' votes are legitimate. That's not the power of the federal government. And Vice President Pence knew that if he threw out a state's electors, that he would be violating the Constitution in doing so. Remember, Vice President Pence swore an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States, not Donald Trump. So Vice President Pence went with the Constitution, and he went forward counting up the ballots of the Electoral College, certified that Joe Biden would be the next president and take over on January 20th. Now, while it is fun to make fun of some of the more eccentric people there at the riots, there was some pure straight up evil there.
Some in the mob could be heard calling for the vice president's head. There are some reports that those zip ties may have been meant for Pence.
There were people outside that hung up a noose, and of course, as you know, some people died. The U.S. Capitol's never been breached before like this. In the 1950s, there were a couple Puerto Rican nationalists that fired a semi-automatic weapon in the Capitol building to protest the United States policy on immigration and Puerto Rico's status as a territory, but no one died in that attack. And it wasn't an entire mob of people running through with free range. I mean, just in the past year, you all have seen the destruction and the ravages of both the far right and the far left. It doesn't matter if it's someone's business or the Capitol building. Passionate mobs incited by the far right and the far left can take away people's lives and livelihoods. Speaking of inciting mobs, hopefully you remember from your lesson on the First Amendment that one of the restricted types of speech that's not protected by the First Amendment is incitement. And that's got President Trump and some of his allies in big trouble. Quite a few people are saying President Trump and his allies that incited that mob should be arrested and at least expelled from government. Even Speaker Pelosi has advocated for Mike Pence to remove President Trump with the 25th Amendment. What is the 25th Amendment, you may ask? Well, let's figure it out. To understand the 25th Amendment and why it's in the Constitution, we've got to go back to the assassination of John F. Kennedy in the 1960s. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, was in the same motorcade as Kennedy, and some reports earlier that day insisted that he was also wounded in the assassination attempt. Now, LBJ, President Johnson, was sworn in about 2 hours after JFK's death, but the whole situation raised some serious concerns. Now, while the Constitution does say that the vice president is next in line if the president dies or resigns or is unable to perform the office's duties, the Constitution never spelled out specifically how a vice president would become president, and the Constitution also didn't say anything about how a vice president is replaced if they vacated office, or what happens when a president became unable to perform their duties while in office. Maybe they have a heart attack, or maybe they start getting dementia and they go crazy. Who knows? So once Lyndon B. Johnson took over, people got a little more worried because he had some known health issues with his heart. And the next 2 people in line for the presidency, according to the Presidential Succession Act in 1947, were 71-year-old John McCormack, the Speaker of the House, and 86-year-old Carl Hayden, the Senate pro tempore. So when you got all these old dudes that could kill over at any moment, and you live in a day and age where there's nuclear weapons that could obliterate the entire city of Washington, D.C. in an instant, you may want to have this stuff written out. So Section 1 of the 25th Amendment says that the vice president becomes a president when the presidency becomes vacant under 3 circumstances: death, resignation, and removal from office. Section 2 of the 25th Amendment says that the president has the power to name a new vice president if that office became vacant with the permission of Congress. So Congress would have to approve of the new vice president. The other 2 sections of the 25th Amendment detail the process for the vice president to serve as acting president if the president was unable to perform his or her official duties, and how to resolve disputes about the president's ability to discharge official powers. So not only were the people that wrote the 25th Amendment worried about their current situation, but they had also remembered times in the past where presidents such as Woodrow Wilson had strokes and they started beginning to lose their mind a little bit towards the end of their presidencies. In fact, with Woodrow Wilson, his wife, the First Lady, pretty much ran the country behind the scenes the last little bit of his presidency. And he could barely even hold his hand up to sign a document. So it's the last 2 sections of the 25th Amendment that are particularly relevant to what's going on in 2021. These last 2 sections that mention how to remove a crazy president or a president that is unable to serve in office. Now remember, impeachment is for charging and removing a president who is unfit for office, meaning they've committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And that actually is an option we'll talk about later with President Trump right now. But in regards to the last 2 sections of the 25th Amendment, they mention that the vice president and the majority of the cabinet heads, since they know the president best, would have to write a written declaration to the pro tempore of the Senate and the Speaker of the House and say, hey, the president is not able to do their job. As soon as those written declarations are submitted, the vice president becomes president. The president can then write back to Congress and state, hey, I'm perfectly fine, and they can take the presidency back. Then the vice president and the cabinet have 4 days to write back to Congress, refuting the president's claim that they're fine. Then the power goes back to the vice president. So if we have a tug of war where it goes back and forth, Congress then has to convene in 48 hours, and then they have 21 days to hold a hearing to decide. They need a 2/3 majority vote in the House and the Senate in order to remove the president and install the vice president. If they can't get that 2/3 majority, then that power goes back to the president. Nancy Pelosi and many other members of Congress, both Republicans and Democrats, are afraid President Trump might incite more violence or might still try to overturn the election and install himself as maybe some sort of a dictator. So they want to get him out of there before he does any more damage and install Mike Pence as vice president for the remaining little bit of his presidency. Now, this part of the 25th Amendment has actually been used before. When President Reagan had experienced some surgeries, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, became acting president while Reagan was out having surgeries. And George W. Bush, when he had some surgeries where he was incapacitated and under the knife, his vice president, Dick Cheney, became president for a few hours until Bush regained consciousness and was out of recovery. Now, Joe Biden's also really up there in age too. So if he has to have any surgeries, or maybe, God forbid, he start getting dementia or something like that, then Kamala Harris and the cabinet may have to invoke the 25th Amendment. And if Joe Biden were to unfortunately pass away and Kamala Harris became president, then we would want to try to avoid one of the many situations we've had in the past where a vice president becomes president and then there's no vice president under them for an extended period of time. It's actually happened quite a bit. Now, besides the 25th Amendment, there is another way I just mentioned earlier. They could impeach and remove President Trump. Now, yes, President Trump has already been impeached, but he wasn't removed last time. The appealing thing about impeaching and convicting President Trump of treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors in this case would be that you bar him from future office. It means he couldn't run for president again in 2024 or any election after that. And yes, even if Joe Biden becomes president and President Trump is no longer president, Congress could impeach and convict him of a crime that would bar him from future office, even if he's not in office anymore. I mean, if you were to steal money from your place of employment and then quit your job the next day, they could still go after you for stealing from them. That makes sense. And nowhere in the Constitution does it say you can only impeach and convict a president of a crime when he's in office. It doesn't say in there that you can't go after him after they've left. Now, the House voting to impeach President Trump and the Senate voting by a 2/3 majority to convict him would not be enough to bar him from running in 2024 again. There's one third and final additional step that's needed to bar Trump from running in 2024, and that would be for the Senate to have a separate vote on that very question. Remember, that impeachment clause we went over at the beginning of the year states that judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office. That means it can't go any farther than just simply removing the president from office. And then it says, though, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, but the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. What's all that fancy mumbo jumbo mean? It essentially means what I just told you, that yes, you need to impeach and remove the president, but if you want to bar him from future office, then you have to figure out some other way to decide that separate issue. And over time, the Senate has decided that a simple majority in their chamber will suffice to bar a president from future office. Now, some people have been wondering, so can he actually run again, even if he lost the last election? And what about Vice President Mike Pence? Could he run for president again in the future? Well, that leads us to the 22nd Amendment. The origins of the 22nd Amendment go back to when FDR was president. President Roosevelt won 4 straight elections and almost served 4 full terms. That's like 12 years. I mean, think back to 2009 and imagine if we had the same president since then. He died in the first year of his 4th term, but he served as president from 1933 to 1945. He's the only president to serve more than 2 terms. Now, after Roosevelt was done, some became really concerned that someone could have so much power for so long. I mean, ruling a nation for that long was pretty characteristic of dictatorships. And if he was so well loved by the people, it's very possible he could have gotten away with just about anything. He could have gotten away with a heck of a lot more than he did. Seeing he was so beloved by the people and that he would not be threatened in an election, Roosevelt made risky and tyrannical moves that increased his power, such as court packing and putting Japanese into internment camps. If you talk to anyone that grew up during the Great Depression, many of them think about President Roosevelt almost like a savior, someone that saved them from the Great Depression and led them through most of World War II. He was so well beloved that he could have, and he did, start taking advantage of the fact that he could do just about anything and win re-election. That's kind of dangerous. Lessons of history show us a concern, though. Anytime there's a politician that has such a fanatical group of followers that are so dedicated to them, they can take advantage of that and ride that wave of momentum into a dictatorship. That's kind of what happened with Julius Caesar when he transformed the Roman Republic into a dictatorship. So to prevent a politician from riding a wave of popularity into, 12, 16, 20 years in the presidency to the point where people are like, why even have an election anymore? We love this guy. Framers of the 22nd Amendment crafted this amendment to limit the president to only serving for 2 terms. Now, the 22nd Amendment doesn't say that the president has to serve 2 consecutive terms. So if a president serves for 4 years and they lose re-election, then 4 years later, they could run again. In fact, they could keep running and running. But if they win election twice and they serve 2 full terms, then they can't run again. To simplify that, if a president has served 8 years in office, they're done. Some of our founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson, for example, argued that if people constantly won re-election and they made a career out of politics, that they would start feeling entitled to have a job in politics, and that could lead to danger. After George Washington's 2nd term ended in 1796, he decided not to run again. From that point on, many argued that he had established a 2-term tradition, that no man should serve as president for longer than 8 years. Washington believed anyone in power should always return back to the people and not aim to create a career out of being president. He feared someone having that power for that long would turn into a tyrant or almost like a king. But not everyone was a fan of the 22nd Amendment. Harry Truman said it was bad, stupid, the worst amendment in the Constitution besides prohibition. Ronald Reagan said it was an infringement on the democratic rights of the people, even though the people used the democratic process to pass it. But their argument was, hey, if the people love someone so much, then they should be allowed to keep re-electing them if they feel like they're doing a great job. But sometimes the presidency can have a big physical and mental toll on someone. And if someone's really old already going into the presidency, who knows what they're going to be like coming out? And maybe it's a good idea to limit them to 2 terms for our good and their good. I mean, just look at these pictures of presidents before their presidency and after their presidency. Here's Abraham Lincoln before his presidency and him after his presidency. Here's Woodrow Wilson before and after. Here's FDR before and after. Though granted, though, he had 4 terms. Here's Ronald Reagan before and after. There's George W. Bush before and after. There's Barack Obama before and after. And here's likely Joe Biden before and after. Now, what about the vice president? Because the 22nd Amendment actually has no limits on how long someone could serve as a vice president. Some people have wondered, well, if Donald Trump is removed through either the 25th Amendment or through the impeachment process, and Mike Pence becomes president, how many terms could he run for after this? Would his few days in office count as a full term? The answer is this. If a vice president takes over within the first 2 years of a president's term, and they finish out the rest of that term, and they can only run for one more term after that. But if a vice president were to take over for a president within the final 2 years of their first term or their last term, whenever it is, then the vice president could then run for 2 more terms. So that means theoretically, someone could serve as president for a total of 10 years. If they took over as vice president within the last 2 years of their president's term, then they could run for 2 more terms after that. So yes, if Mike Pence were to become president here in the last few days before Biden takes over, then Mike Pence would be eligible to serve 2 more terms as president, providing that he actually ran for election and won election for both of those terms. And yes, if Congress doesn't impeach and convict President Trump of a high crime like inciting violence, trying to overturn the election, then President Trump could run for 1 more term. But if they do convict him of something, then he can't. So in all, what happened with the situation at the Capitol is a very complex issue. And if you're still confused on exactly what happened, you're not alone. So I'll summarize it again using Star Wars to help, using, of course, my awful editing skills.
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire. Your new empire? Don't make me kill you. Anakin, my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy! If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. I will do what I must. Close the blast door!
They are still coming through. This is impossible! The Senate will decide your fate.
I am the Senate.
Not yet.
It's treason, then.
You were my brother, Anakin! I loved you!
Okay, maybe not the most accurate thing, but you get the idea. Now, I know that some of my students support President Trump, and I know some of my students are very much opposed to President Trump, but I hope we can all agree that the violence that was used at the Capitol that resulted in lives lost was wrong. And I think we can all agree that tensions have escalated in part because each side has tried to outdo the rhetoric of the other side. But I still did want to talk about this issue because it is going to change the course of U.S. history. It's forcing us to answer constitutional questions we really hadn't thought that much about ever before. I can't predict the future. Heck, I don't even know how much has changed since the time I made this video to the time you're watching this video. But I do know the violence starts when the talking stops. I know it's a cliche, and dadgummit, I hate cliches. But we would all do well to love our neighbor and to actually begin to genuinely listen to our neighbors, even if we hate what they have to say. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. Here's your assignments for this week. Obviously, you've got this ed puzzle and one other ed puzzle. Both are due on Wednesday. And then you've got a Google form over the 25th Amendment, which will be due on Thursday. As always, reach out if you all need anything. Reach out too if you have any questions about what's going on or just want to talk about it. And have a great week.